Yeah, it totally was. Well, this is their class time. This is normally when we meet for class, so I'm pulling double duty here.
We like that.
Yeah.
Are you getting paid double too? Haha.
As my boss is fond of saying, I'm feeding two birds with one hand.
Where do you teach?
I teach up at Arcadia University.
Oh, okay.
All right, I think 1 minute has gone by, so I'm just gonna get started. And hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you all for being here with me tonight. And this is exciting because this is Fleisher from a Distance, the Wind Challenge edition, which is a special program designed to showcase Wind Challenge artists through the years. So the Fleisher Challenge was founded in 1978 as a platform for local artists to exhibit. This effort was later generously supported by Dina and Jerry Wynn through the Wynn Foundation, bringing the Wind Challenge to the forefront of exhibitions in Philadelphia. Now, this important exhibition is supported by the Dina Wynn Art Foundation, and I invite you to find out more by visiting dinawynnfoundation.art, and I'm gonna put that in the chat so you can all go there later. This is one of the most prestigious exhibitions in our area, and every year, 6 to 9 artists are selected to exhibit in our galleries. Tonight's artist, Matthew Borgen, was selected for the 2018 Wind Challenge. And I welcome Matthew. Matthew's still here with us in Philadelphia. Matthew, how are you?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
Very good. How's life? Tell me a little bit since 2018, the last time I saw you. How's life?
Yeah, it's been a shorter time than some of your other speakers, but no, it's been the last couple of years have been really productive artistically. I've had an opportunity to show at a lot of cool spaces and had time to make a lot of work, and I'm teaching and working in exhibitions at Arcadia University, where I've been for almost 15 years, which it doesn't seem like that long, but yes.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like, I know you've been here longer than me now, so you really are from Philadelphia, not from Ohio anymore.
There's certain days where I sound like I'm more from Philadelphia than from Ohio, but absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, anyway, thank you again for being here with us tonight. And I'm just gonna give it to you. You can take over the presentation. If anyone has any questions, you're free to ask the questions directly to Matthew. If you feel shy, put it in the chat. I'll ask it for you. And thank you again. So Matthew, go ahead, take it over.
Let me bring up my screen. If you just let me know if you can see this okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, hello again, everybody. I created a sort of title for this talk to sort of help me collect my thoughts. I call it No Wrong Turns. One of the things I wanted to focus in on tonight in particular, because I knew there would be students in the audience, or I sort of counted on that. I wanted to talk about the importance within my creative practice of exploring areas which may at first feel like tangents or even dead ends in terms of subject matter or approach. And I found, as an art student, as a graduate student, as a teacher, I attended many art lectures, and they tend to move in a very sort of chronological line, sort of step A to step B to step C. And they often tend to move from success to success, which I think is very natural, but it makes me think about how students perceive these kinds of talks, or how I perceive these kinds of talks. And it often made me feel like if I was struggling, if I was feeling anxiety about what I was making, if I sort of did something and I didn't succeed right away, I felt like maybe I was doing something wrong. And as I've grown older and more experienced, I realized that maybe the lectures I was seeing, or sort of depictions of artists in popular media, they tend to emphasize the eureka moment and don't often place that moment in context. So what I wanted to do tonight is to show what I've been working on since the Wind Challenge, kind of show a little bit of like sort of that show itself being kind of a risk for me in terms of my approach, and how I've sort of moved off from that work into different realms, different series of works. And I want to show you what I think have been successes, and I'm going to show you things that I think did not work out well. I'm sort of focused in on the idea of failing forward, I think is a term that gets used a lot. So this idea that we almost, the idea that failure is this negative outcome when really it's a place where we sort of learn, grow, something, if it doesn't entirely work, maybe parts of it work, and then it can lead to something else. And, that's, I think the other thing I think that we sort of miss out on as students, as we develop our practice, is we tend to think that if we struggle, if there is anxiety, that we are doing something wrong. And as we get older and more experienced, that will go away. And I would actually, what I've learned over the last couple of years is that I need the anxiety, I need the struggle. It's the thing that tells me that I'm challenging myself, that I'm trying something new. And it's not something that you outgrow. It's not something that you remove from your practice. It's actually, it is just the nature of the practice. So I want to show you some examples of that. So let me move into the images I've brought with. Trying to get my screen to cooperate. Okay, that seemed to work. I wanted to start with a quote that was important to me in school. It was by Chuck Jones, the animator, who was associated with Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes for many, many years. He said every artist has thousands of bad drawings in them, and the only way to get rid of them is to draw them out. It's something that really stuck with me. It's just, it creates this sort of space where it's okay for something to not turn out well. And in fact, things won't turn out well a lot of the time. I'm a big baseball fan, and it reminds me too of batting, how the people that go into the Hall of Fame are successful 3 out of 10 times. So just this idea that maybe failures, tangents, trying things that a little differently are actually part of the process. It's not something to be avoided, it's something to be embraced. I've been working with appropriated comic imagery for about 5 years. The earliest pieces, which this is an example, it's called Bullet Trajectory Composition number 3. I've made 3 of these. I'd like to go back and make it more at some point. They deal with comic books, sequential art in a more formalized structural way. It sort of analyzes the structure of comic books, deconstructs the sort of normal linear narrative, and thinks, approaches the panels just like spaces. And when you sort of give away the responsibility of the narrative thread, what are the possibilities? And so in these works, they're all selected because it's somebody shooting at something from, out of the panel. And so I'm just imagining this sort of arbitrary panel where all these bullets end up, and they end up creating a kind of abstract formal composition at the center. So the piece is not quite figurative, it's not quite abstract, it's not quite narrative, but it also has components of that. And so a lot of my early works dealing with comic book imagery deal with that formal structure. If there's political or social comment in this work, for example, we are looking at people sort of firing guns, and so that subject matter comes into play, I think, very quickly. It's really sort of not intentional, or it's not done overtly. It is something that's just sort of coming through with the work itself. With the opportunity to do the Wind Challenge, I wanted to maybe talk about um, social political issues in a more overt way, which is something I had never attempted before in my own work. I'd always tried to be pretty socially benign, but as I'd been showing the more formal work, I had been receiving feedback, and I think justifiably so, that I was dealing with content that is very loaded in terms of privilege, in terms of dealing with stereotypes about race. Women are traditionally not portrayed well in the comic books of this era, the sort of mid 20th century era. And I was feeling more and more like if I didn't find a way to address it, I was just sort of fetishizing it or becoming complicit in a narrative that is, not inclusive and rather outmoded. And so one way to try to address that, I think, was to try to utilize that appropriated imagery in a way that constructed a new narrative or allowed for conversations about new or more inclusive narratives to happen, which ended up being the real challenge in the show. Is probably the most challenging show I've probably ever done. Was very much a challenge to me and my own personal privilege. Really having to think about where my agency is in creating images. Where could I sort of enter into a conversation where I was not stepping on somebody else's toes, where I was not sort of disrupting somebody else's story? This work, came out of the sort of the outcome of the 2016 election. I was definitely seeing, evidence of social injustice, which, in hindsight was always there, but I think people, for myself, it became more acutely aware. And I felt like I had to respond in some way. But I had to respond in a way that that was more direct, but that was also way to have a conversation with the viewer where I had agency, but I was not usurping somebody else's voice. And so I had struck upon this idea of sort of doing an up-to-date version of Dante's Inferno, thinking about America as a sort of hell landscape and sort of traveling through that. And this first image, which was sort of the anchor piece in the show, in my mind was an amalgam or a summation of a lot of different pieces that I was thinking about for the show. And one of the things I think about, what I recall with this show, is that I started hundreds of images for the show. I have a backlog of dozens of images that I started and never completed. And so this piece was supposed to be sort of an anchor point. It's based very loosely both on Washington crossing the Delaware and images derived from Michelangelo's The Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel, in which Michelangelo borrows imagery from Dante's Inferno, in particular, sort of the river Styx and traveling to hell. And so the characters in this sort of allegory represented different aspects of what I was thinking about, or different ways of approaching this topic. Let me see if I think I have a comparison image here. So we can see that the composition is very much appropriated, derived from this famous image of Washington. Uncle Sam is sort of the boat master carrying people across the river Styx. And what was sort of important for me in this piece was to try to find a way to create a kind of author or a narrator who was in some way or as much as possible could be neutral. And so Washington in this image and in many of the images from the show is replaced with these two astronauts, these sort of explorers. In this case, they remove their helmets and you see that there's nobody inside. So they, you know, they're not gendered, there is no race. The idea is that the viewer might be able to place themselves in this position. And just to try to think about narrative in a slightly different way. I also borrowed from this show from the well-known Gustave Doré, I might be mispronouncing the name, etchings that are based on the Inferno. And so I was often pulling imagery directly from those etchings and placing them in a new context. So again, here we have the two astronauts encountering these people who are buried upside down, which in Dante's text are people who partook of indulgences from the church. So they would sell indulgences and make personal profit from the church. So kind of you know, that's not really carried over in the new image. But I thought about these as a series of comic books almost, that, you know, I was just imagining, like in the 50s, somebody came up with the idea of doing a Dante's Inferno comic, and that these astronauts would encounter a new scene or a new kind of strange, absurd, horrific story every month.
And Matthew, I do have a question about, are they drawings or collage? What's your process?
That's a really good question. They start off very much as collages. Much of the imagery is appropriated. It's collaged together in Photoshop, and then I normally redraw it on a tablet. I have an iPad Pro and I use Procreate, and I basically like re-ink the images. They go back into Photoshop for coloring and other kinds of treatment. And I do have some images that I brought along to kind of show that process a little bit better. This was a piece I think that was probably the most successful from the show. It's called A Place of Many Groans, which is based on a quote from Dante. He does a lot of work in the poem of trying to describe sounds. And I made this connection between the cries of agony and these sort of exclamations in comic books. And what I found was really successful about that, and dealing with it in more of a spatial aspect. Again, it sort of played with authorship. So the person sort of exclaiming here is whoever happens to be standing in front of it. And so I think what I liked about this piece is that I could talk about specific things if I wished, but it really leaves a lot of latitude for the viewer to understand this in whatever way, you know, they'll maybe place their own stress or their own anxiety or their own exclamations in front of it. And it really becomes active once people are in front of it. And as promised, here's some images that didn't work out for the show. Like I said, I kind of want to show some of the hundreds of images that I did for the show that did not work. I was thinking about, you know, there are images of people guilty of the sin of wrath who are in the river Styx, submerged. And so I found this image of a swimming pool. And so I had all these people struggling in the water. The piece on the right was beginning to think about the sin of gluttony. And I really hated to cut this piece because I really fell in love with the title, which is Butter Depravity. So it's partly based on the scene after Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and people have built a false idol. In this case, it's been replaced by a butter cow from like the Iowa State Fair. And I really liked the pun. I stopped working on these because it was showing people being harmed or violence being done to people, and you know, particularly women and people from underrepresented groups. And I didn't want to perpetuate that kind of depiction of violence. I never wanted to finish an image where somebody was being harmed. Like, it was important to me to not do that. And you know, that I honestly found that very challenging. How do you talk about sin? How do you talk about suffering without inflicting suffering in the imagery and perpetuating that sort of narrative? So as much as I found these appealing, I had to take a really hard look at myself and recognize that these were not going to work. So it's not necessarily that I disliked them or that they were sort of bad formally. I didn't like what they were depicting. And so I had to abandon them. And like I say, that became the case for dozens and dozens of images for this show. And it was really, like I said, it was really challenging. There were a lot of late nights of like obsessing about this and trying to navigate this kind of subject matter. When in reality, as a privileged white male, like these things that I was noticing, they weren't happening to me. They were happening to other people. And so I would try to be very respectful of those stories. This was a piece that actually was started during this time that I finished much later, where it was just this woman in her garden. She was watching a plane flying overhead, and I had been collecting images of planes crashing. I just ran into sort of a bunch of them, and she became kind of an icon. There is sort of a merry sort of religious iconography going on here with the sort of the flatness. The flames almost create a kind of a halo, I think. So again, it was sort of riffing on some of the religious iconography that I was looking at as part of that show. As I was preparing for that show, I saw another exhibition up in New York. I'm trying to find the name of that show. It's the David Zwirner Gallery, I believe, and it was called Endless Enigma. It was in the fall of 2008. It was a really cool show, and very rare to see in a New York gallery sort of work spanning sort of hundreds of years of different practice. But it all focused on work that was like, it was sort of a history almost of sort of surreal art. And I found it very inspiring just because it was really refreshed after all this kind of the anxiety and soul searching of the Fleisher show. For me, I was really enjoying seeing something that just felt very surreal and absurd and a little macabre. And I saw this particular painting called The Four Elements, and I went home and I started sort of reworking the composition in my head, but I was accumulating images of white men being afraid and kind of being afraid of each other, but also being kind of afraid of nothing in particular, or not being afraid of anything that's sort of real and tangible that's actually going to hurt them. And that's a theme that's reoccurred in my work in the last several years. Shortly after Wind Challenge, I was given the opportunity to do a solo exhibition at the Abington Art Center, which from my connection to Arcadia and knowing about the lithographer Benton Spruance, I was familiar with Alverthorpe as being the location of Lessing J. Rosenwald's amazing print and rare book collection, which is now a part of the National Gallery and the National Archives. He probably had one of the most, prolific and diverse collection of prints that were in private hands. And by all accounts, he was incredibly generous, not only with loans to institutions to show this work, but for people to just show up and make appointments and see the work. And so it's a beautiful, Art Deco space. And this is an image actually of Benton Spruance bringing students from then Beaver College to Alverthorpe to view prints. Of course, in this instance, they're looking at his print, but there were other prints too, like students could handle Goya or Bacon prints. And that, that's something that, working at Arcadia University and dealing with the permanent collection, I was very familiar with. So the opportunity to work at Abington and do a show at Abington, my sort of background in a previous life as a site-specific installation artist, the idea of like responding to a space and creating work based on sort of information about its history really set the tone for this show. And that sort of coupled with my interest in the Endless Enigma show sort of took me on this path towards making things that were a little weird and not feeling too apologetic about it, like not worrying about whether things necessarily made sense. And you can see this is the sunroom as it appeared in Rosenwald's day, and then they've since turned it into an exhibition space, which is where my show was located. I mean, this installation shot is interesting for the fact that, for example, the image of the stairway above the doors with the two men running is a piece that I didn't particularly care for, but there is a great sort of rolling staircase in the main lobby at the art center, and it made that kind of reference to that space. And so even though I didn't think too much of that piece in particular, it actually worked for the show. So in terms of like the overall installation, I wanted to include it. I took a lot of inspiration from prints that had been in Rosenwald's collection, and those were the basis for a lot of the works in the show. This is an image of Goya's Ways of Flying. I made my own version and tried to replicate the sort of the etching process here, all in the computer, but sort of taking the concept of flight and using more comic book conventions of flight, so like rockets and vampires and flying horses. This image includes a large triptych that I called Covenant Land, and it took its compositions from many sort of religious prints from the collection. So you can see this is Temptation in the Wilderness, which is based on a print called The Temptation of Christ from 1500. This actually isn't a painting in the collection, but one thing I like to tell my students is that if you make a rule for yourself, you should also break it when it doesn't work for you. So this is a painting that's actually from the PMA, and this is Moses in the burning bush, but it's actually an attempt at showing the progress of the narrative, which in my mind related to comic books, the idea of sort of seeing a sequence. So you're seeing Moses twice in the same image. And my version is on the right, where God is replaced with an atomic bomb blast. And Moses is sort of mutating due to some mistranslations in the Bible from like the original into sort of Latin and other languages. Moses was often depicted with horns. And so I just thought the idea of him sort of being exposed to radiation and growing horns made sense in some kind of circuitous way. And this just gives you a sense, again, so this is that piece sort of in process. So I started off with sort of finding images of just sort of a prototypical superhero pose. So this is, Captain Marvel sort of standing in front of God. And at a certain point, I thought about depicting Moses as Charlton Heston, since he was in the 10 Commandments. But at a certain point, I also decided I didn't want to make Moses white. In all likelihood, he would not have been white. And that's actually my colleague Jamar came up with the idea, which I stole, of placing the radiation suit on the character so that sort of race was sort of a non-issue at this point. And at this point, he's also turning green. So this gives you a sense of what the pieces look like before they are redrawn. They're cutouts that are all placed in digitally in Photoshop. This is another piece from the show called Horizons, which was really based on it. I was playing with my own dream imagery. I had an anxiety dream as I was making the show because I was on a tight deadline, and I kept getting hit by waves. And in this dream, I was just getting hit by waves over and over again. And I had actually found this image of a man sort of swimming or sort of treading water, and I just repeated it. I wanted to sort of replicate the feeling of the dream, the sort of the anxiety of the dream. And what ended up happening with this piece is that it actually sort of harkens back to the more structural, formal work with comic books that I'd been dealing with, in that it implies a narrative. It implies that maybe forward progress is being made, that time is passing. he, the horizon is this abstract concept really. And so he could be getting closer to the horizon, or he could be staying exactly where he is. And really both interpretations are plausible. But it puts the viewer in a place where they're not sure, even though it seems relatively straightforward, what's actually happening. This is a body of work that I abandoned, that I got excited about in the wake of that show that I ended up not following through on. I might still, but I started seeing these prints of like the martyrdom of saints. And if you're not familiar with the prints of the depiction of famous martyrs being martyred, they can be really quite violent and quite graphic. And these people often are depicted dying in horrific ways, which reminded me very much of some of the horror comics that I was looking at that time. And so I started playing with them in terms of sort of medieval or Renaissance religious iconography, along with sort of vintage images of America in the 50s, this kind of like quote unquote heyday, or sort of the nostalgic epicenter of American popular culture. So in this case, Saint Sebastian, who was shot full of arrows, did not die actually from the arrows. I guess he lived and kept on going. But in this case, I was thinking about a Boy Scout trip kind of going wrong, and the people using the Boy Scout master as target practice. It's a little dark, but I guess that's what I was interested in, was just like these images that were so famous and so full of sort of religious content were also quite graphic and violent as well. So there was kind of a paradox there. I've started several of these. I've not finished any of them. And just sort of a quick shout out, the little Boy Scouts in the back. The one really reminds me of my nephew Johnny, who's in the Scouts right now and can be a little nefarious on his own. So
I need to mention that in that piece, especially,
yeah,
the Boy Scouts, and then the other in the original, they're the three people, and they're both conversing about the same thing. I don't know what that is, but
yes. I mean, the serendipity of finding an image in an old comic book that matches up with a 15th century print that's a special day.
And I'm wondering how in the world do you do that? Like, do you have a collection that is that extensive, or?
There are, I mean, one of the reasons why I can do this work is because there are websites that are now put together by heroic individuals who collect scans of comic books that have fallen into the public domain. Again, the mid 20th century was sort of the heyday for comic book creation in the United States, and really in other parts of the world as well. But most of that material, nobody saw the need to actually continue to copyright. So many of these books from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s are in the public domain. So people have scanned them. They're available online on databases, and they're there just for people to go through and enjoy. So I go through those books, and I sort of intuitively grab pages that interest me. I mean, I have like a running list of things I'm always looking for, but also things that I'm just strike me as odd or different or funny or absurd, or and that's sort of, so collecting images of Boy Scouts, I was like, I don't know. There's actually a lot of I'm going to blank on the name of it, but there's this comic book that was put out by the Roman Catholic Church that ran for decades, and actually it was called Treasure Chest. And for me, it's an amazing resource, because so often it's not about superheroes, it's not about explosions, it's a lot about history and religious stories. And there's often a lot of people standing around not doing anything. And sometimes that's actually what I need the most, is people sort of standing around not doing anything, which is actually hard to find in comic books. So Treasure Chest has been a treasure chest. So,
Right.
This is more of a transitional piece. This is definitely came from a horror comic book, but again, in the wake of these other shows and thinking about privilege, and really thinking about sort of issues of racism and white supremacy, sort of the predominance of the white male protagonist narrative is something I'm very much is very much on my mind. So I found this horror image of a woman being attacked by these ghosts of like the kids from Leave It to Beaver, it looks like, and I replaced her with just sort of this white male painter, and so he's at a moment where he's about to begin work. He's surrounded on all sides by history and context and sort of apparitions of who he is. So like I said, this is kind of a piece going from the more absurd, surreal items that I was working with and moving into this series, which I called Through a Glass. This is a series that depicts sort of images that have to do with self-analysis or sort of becoming aware of oneself or sort of inner reflection. So I'm often using mirrors or picture frames, which all are meant to evoke the comic panel itself. So this was actually an image where I replaced a particularly racist depiction of Asian soldiers, which was, very prolific in the World War II era. And I replaced them with these mirrors. So these folks are sort of confronting themselves or thinking about their own sort of how they are portrayed or how, what they are. And the three of them, for some reason, they just reminded me maybe of Freud's like id, ego, superego, that these three could, rather than being individuals, could be all part of like a single identity or personality. It's a piece called Affirmation. I actually didn't change this very much from the comic book. I think I made him look more superhero-y, but I think in the original context, this was a man that created a robot of himself because I think he just didn't want to go to a party. And so he sent this robot to a costume party. But I think for me, it was sort of a response to thinking about sort of my own complicity in sort of privilege, thinking about how do I face that complicity and yet still maybe try to find sort of some sense of self-value. And that it definitely at moments of high anxiety, you're sort of disconnected from your own affirmations. Like you may try to sort of build yourself up, but you're also disconnected from that at the same time. So in my mind, all three of these characters are sort of the same individual, but thinking about themselves in different ways. I used to have this up in my studio for the better part of the last year or so. This is called A Moment of Insecurity. And again, just a moment where like when you're by yourself and alone and sort of doubts creep in, I think. This is actually a piece that I pulled directly from the comic. I didn't change it. I was just really interested in this man making this statement that the woman was a dream. He's obviously not saying that she's literally a dream, but it can, out of context, it's reminding me of dream imagery. It's reminding me of moments where you're in the middle of a dream, you understand that it's a dream, but you either the dream is sort of undermined by the fact that you know it, or it just sort of continues on. You're like, yeah, I know I'm dreaming at this point. And I'm particularly struck by there's this expression of indifference, which I found fascinating. It's almost he's just like revealed. He's like, you're a dream. And she's like, you okay? This is a piece I didn't finish. I couldn't figure out how to finish it. This was a man being attacked by Napoleon. I changed it to him being running away screaming from an abstract painting, which I had part of the painting from a comic book. I had to figure out the rest of the abstract painting myself. But for an example, this is what the imagery will normally look like coming out of Procreate. Once I've sort of taken sort of parts from other comic books, I will ink it up in Procreate. And this is what will get fed back into Photoshop, where I'll add the coloring and maybe other effects. This is a series that I call Love and Other Unexplained Phenomena, which was really a challenge to myself. I was receiving, fortunately, I was receiving requests to show work in different venues, but I kept being asked if I was doing anything that was maybe not social, not political, in no way sort of violent or offensive in any way. And I kept like, well, I don't know that I have anything right now. So I kind of gave myself the challenge. I sort of gave myself an internal challenge of, could I create something that came off as more benign, but was still of interest to me, that I still felt like I was exploring something that was worthwhile. I started looking at a lot of romance comics, and it really started to become about just putting sort of these simple moments of joy or happiness in sort of stranger contexts. So this piece is called From the Earth to Lover's Lane. This is called Things Are Heating Up. But inevitably, I started thinking about dreams and anxiety again. It's like I say, I sort of take these moments and I explore somewhere, and then I end up at a place where I didn't expect. So in an attempt to make these sort of relatively safe, benign works, I ended up making this piece about obsession. This piece doesn't exist in the world. Actually, a lot of these pieces only end up getting printed or framed if I need them for a particular show. But this was a simple panel where a woman was mourning the passing of her husband or boyfriend, whose name was Rick. And, I was thinking about moments when I'm lying in bed and I just obsess over things from my past, and giving that some physical weight through this sort of excess of thought balloons. So this is a piece where, if I were to execute it, the woman would be in a frame on the wall, and she would be surrounded by these individual thought balloons that are either printed on vinyl. They would sort of like overlap the two-dimensional object. So this is just a digital mock-up of what it would look like. And these are some that didn't really work out, but I just found funny. I didn't know that anybody else would find them funny, but I got a kick out of them. There was something about the gesture of the woman to the left, and just it's sort of this glorification. And I just thought it would be funny if she was in love with Satan. But it's also kind of like a handsome, like white male Satan, which was a little different. And again, I just happened to find this image of a clown in a romance comic. There was a romance comic where I found like this woman was like involved with a clown, and he just had the right sort of gesture or head nod to fit into this holiday romance. And just the idea of poor Nancy, she doesn't realize that love is only a game to Marcel. Like I said, I don't know that I'll ever get back to these, but they like made me laugh for 5 minutes. And like I said, I have dozens of these where things just maybe struck me funny for a second and I moved on. But like I try them. It's like, all right, let's, I'll look at this cover and say, well, what if Satan was there? And so I go and look for an image of Satan and try it. I don't know that it's going to work out. I don't know that it's going to be the greatest thing I ever do, but it helps me get the things out. Like as Chuck Stone says, get the bad drawings out. I've been focused a lot on, again, the sort of the prototypical white male protagonist. I have been trying to find ways to discuss privilege without showing people being hurt or abused. And so I've been finding like metaphors of superpowers, or just sort of being sort of, beyond normal as really great ways to express the idea of privilege and what that is. So, we have the white males as giants. sort of looking at the city in a strange way with a kind of a sense of ownership, knocking things down and not really meaning to. But they're not unlike, Godzilla. I'm still working on the series. This is a piece that I haven't been able to quite figure out. I really like the idea of maybe fate being depicted as somebody who's asleep, or maybe somebody reading the paper who's just not paying that close of attention. Haven't quite got this piece to work out just yet. I may come back to it. I may not. And I also started depicting sort of feelings of anxiety as expressed by maybe like this panel being sort of overwhelmed. And this is one of the pieces that I was working on just as we went into quarantine. It's a piece called Boxed In. I'm not really good with crowds myself. So when I see an image like this, I definitely respond to it. And just thinking about the sort of this huddling and the gestures, and really, in part, do these to a certain extent talk about these experiences we have as a country that is so divided, where sort of the most mundane circumstances can become abrasive, violent, conflicted. We're all sort of like, we have lots of space, but we're like, in a way, we're sort of like all sort of forced together. And I think those are the metaphors, at least that I take I bring to these. This was a large piece that I was working on in March of last year. I think it was at first sort of meant to think about sort of political divides. It also definitely was a look back at the imagery of Michelangelo's Last Judgment and the people being carted off to hell, and just these sort of like masses of arms and legs. And as I was working on this in isolation and quarantine, it was definitely being fed by just being afraid to be around people and being near people. And so this idea that you're like basically like the lion's share of these people are being forced into one another and are trying not to touch one another. Some people forego that, some people sort of succumb, some people are fighting, struggling. It just became very symbolic for me for that moment. So it was I don't know. Like I say, one of the things that I find generative in this piece for me is that you can do a lot with gesture and with emotion, and the viewer can bring a lot to it at that point. You're not restricting the viewer's ability to read this and to think about it. And I think that's where my more recent work is going, which is there's a detail of some of the characters. And then these are all characters grabbed either from comic books. I did borrow some gestures from Michelangelo directly, but mostly these are comic book characters all being placed together from different panels. This was more of a response to the riots last summer, where people are just standing around not doing anything, which is kind of how I felt. I mean, I was in my house. Again, I'm not good with crowds. I was scared to death to go outside. So I think in a ways I feel somewhat complicit in this image. So of late, I've been working with just the idea of like, what can I express with simple emotions on the face, simple gestures. I've been focusing on this sort of the deconstructing and turning on its head the narrative of sort of the white male protagonist that is all capable and always has the right solution. I focus on gestures where they are somewhat out of control. Are they nervous? Are they angry? Are they falling? And again, this gives you a sense of how the panels start and, what I might choose to remove. Again, I think that things like white supremacy, racism are based on sort of fear and fear of the unknown and fear of what's going to happen. And so as I'm depicting fear, it's important for me that I'm not necessarily creating a source of that fear or anxiety, that it is more imagined, that it's unknown, and there's room to understand what that could be, and to sort of show this sort of moment of vulnerability. And I think in a way that can help change this sort of predominant narrative, but in a way that I feel like I can talk about it. I can talk about sort of, it was an interesting, we had an interesting speaker. I'm going to blank on the woman's name at the beginning of the semester. She was brought in to discuss the Arcadia's anti-Black racism initiative. And she made a very strong point of talking about white supremacy as something that we are very much dealing with, and that white supremacy is a white person's problem, that it's not right, it's not fair to think that Black people are going to fix white supremacy, that white people have to take this on, they have to deal with it. And so I definitely think about this as I'm sort of using these gestures and these narratives to talk about, emotions that are maybe at the heart of some of these motivations, I think. Right now, I'm thinking about these gestures both as an exhibition and possibly as a book. So this is just an example of what a publication of these figures might look like. I'm getting back to thinking about, it's not a comic book. I'm not thinking about it as a comic book. It's more of an art catalog in my mind. But the idea that there will be pacing to sort of separate these gestures that comes from turning the page and sort of having the implication of time passing because of the cartoon bubbles. This is a piece that I just recently finished. It's part of that Love and Other Unexplained Phenomena series, because I do jump around. Like I say, one thing definitely feeds into the other. I will spare you the backstory of how many iterations this went through. It's almost too painful for me to talk about how many versions this went through, but I wanted to depict just a simple moment of joy of two Black people kissing. I wanted this sort of simple moment of joy, but I was also kind of cognizant of the idea that there are so many circumstances that impedes with that. And, I don't know that this, I feel like this piece is a risk for me. I don't know if this is necessarily what I should be working on or what I should be talking about, but I did have this like very strong impulse to, it was a bit of like wish fulfillment. I was just like, there's so little that I can do personally, but, is there some, how would you give this couple sort of a moment where they didn't have to be worried about the rest of the world? And so I put them on this other planet. I let them get away from the earth for a second and just be able to spend some time together. And like I say, that's, this, so this is the last image I have. What I've been thinking about a lot is again, how could the work and these things that I'm appropriating be used to create new narratives, to create new conversations, to help us talk about things that seem intractable. One thing that I'm trying to do, because again, like I say, I'm not great with crowds. I don't imagine myself going out and protesting and picking up a sign, but what I do, what I can do is I can make art and I can sell it. So the Love series is something I've been selling as a limited edition print. And I try to sell them relatively inexpensively. And I've committed to the proceeds of those sales going to the ACL Foundation of Pennsylvania. So it can help with court costs. It can help support people who are protesting and trying to make positive change. So that's the way that I'm attempting to be more proactive and not just sitting in my living room being outraged. This is my website. This is where you can follow me on Instagram. I'm really grateful to Gerard and to Fleisher and to everybody that's joined us here. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any, but thank you very much.
Before you go into questions, I wanted to ask you, how can you buy the prints that you were just talking about? Just go to your site?
Yeah, I have a little store set up on my site with some of the prints, but also people can just email me and I don't have them all set up yet. It's still something that's in process, but yeah, they're available through my website.
Perfect. And yes, and now if anyone has any questions, please feel free to mute yourself and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat again, and I'm happy to ask. I myself probably have many questions, but now open it to anyone. So I'm gonna start asking questions because I want to know about the mirrors. The mirrors are such a great, especially when the characters are looking at themselves. And was that an idea that came from a comic book, or how did that idea came about?
I think I don't want to pretend like it's, thinking about frames and mirrors as some kind of new invention in art, but as an exploration of the self, I think I'm probably pulling from, Magritte, early surrealist imagery to be sure, but I was also going through a lot of horror comic books, and often the storylines, like an uncommon amount of the storylines, start with either haunted paintings, where something comes out of the painting to attack somebody, or somebody transforms in a mirror, like they look at themselves, or they're old, or they're somebody else, or so lots of haunted mirrors and lots of haunted frames. And so again, it was profligate enough in the books that I was looking at where it started to play as a theme, and I started collecting them. And I think, again, as an artist, when you're looking through superhero comic books, any moment you can find a symbol or indication of artwork, you sort of keep it. And so I sort of accumulated them and realized that they might start to be a series in and of themselves.
Would you say that there's more irony with your mirrors than surrealism?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think I mean for them to be ironic. They may read as ironic. That's entirely possible, but I think they came from a sincere place to talk about self-analysis, self-awareness. I think those were things that were at the forefront of my mind in my studio. And so I think that's what was coming out. So I'd be curious to hear if people think that they're ironic. I don't know that I meant them that way.
I kind of read them that way, but I'm also wanted to talk about your inspiration, because your inspirations are very obvious to me. I mean, when you're talking about every single image you're showing us, it's very obvious that where you're coming from. Yet when you are showing them to us, they're a little bit more private, and you're letting us interpret, these completely.
Well, I think in terms of, if we get back to this idea of failing forward or approaching things like embracing tangents, I think that maybe a barometer that I'm using is for these things to feel like honest self-expression, but that they also give a lot of latitude to the viewer, that they don't need to be divining what I was thinking, that there's room for them to occupy it in some way. And so I think, if I'm being self-critical about works, the ones where I'm being more explicit or more specific are, feel less successful, because if I don't give the viewer enough room to enter in and to create a more interesting conversation with them, then it in my mind, it's not as successful. But it's never about but it has to come from me, and it has to be specific, and it has to be personal, for it to feel like I'm in a place where I can say it in the first place.
Of course. And can we go back, or
Yeah, I think so.
in the conversation about the very first image you showed us was the bullet trajectory, and I think that's the oldest piece in here. Is that correct?
That's true. Yeah, that was the one piece I showed that I did before Fleisher.
And in a way, like the way I read these is sort of like, the way we interact with each other, because we're constantly shooting each other in some way.
I thought of this piece as so sort of benign, but yeah, these people are they're all shooting at something.
And we do that through language. We do that through so many ways.
I mean, that's, maybe that just describes where I was at this time, but I don't think, I didn't ever thought of these as being overtly aggressive. I thought of them as pretty mundane, but I'm thinking about them a little differently at this point.
And would you say your work is quite subtle? Yes, I'm going there.
No, I don't think it's subtle. I think it's better when the more subtle it is, I think probably the better it is. I'll tell you, I think when I'd have this bad habit, and even though, for example, I really love this piece, I'm still rather happy with it, but I think one of my faults is that I will get so obsessed with creating layers of meaning, layers of symbolism, layers of references, and make them so dense with that kind of information that it's unreadable to anyone. So I end up going to a place where nobody else is going. And it's something I have to remind myself not to do, but it's also something I sometimes give myself the indulgence to do. So I think when the pieces are, like I say, I guess I would describe those layers as subtle. It requires a lot of effort on anybody's part to get there. And I kind of don't expect anybody to put that kind of time in.
There was a statement you made that I think is fantastic. And you said, that we are, or you are, complicit with your work. And that's so true, because we all are complicit with whatever we make, in some way, whether we know or not, what we're doing at the moment. And you're so conscious about that, and how that's going to affect somebody, and yet you cannot control that at all,
No, you're absolutely right. And at a certain point, you have to do your due diligence, I think, in terms of, again, for me, just making sure that what I'm saying is coming to some extent from a personal place. But that's why I also, as I say, especially with the work I'm doing with the gestures and sort of focusing on the white male characters, I feel like that gives people, I think it's giving people, or potentially is giving viewers, far more latitude. And that's important to me, that there's not just one conversation to be had there. It opens it up more, which I think is great.
And one more thing, sorry, and when we talked about being subtle, but the horizons, that piece, to me, that was very, very powerful, yet very subtle, and it could be read so many ways, but yet I actually felt the anxiety from it. And that's completely, I was completely sold. I want that piece.
It's very kind. This has actually I've been very fortunate. This piece is, when I've been submitting work to shows, this is the piece that I've been showing a lot. And I almost feel, again, sometimes the best things I do, like I say, I had a dream about this, and so I made it. So it was probably the easiest piece I made for that show, and it's the one that generates maybe the most interesting conversations, and people seem to respond to the most. So that's the thing, you know. So you can agonize and agonize, and I think that's super important. You want to be very self-aware. You want to be very self-critical, and if you do that, if you put in that work, these moments that seem easy are the benefit. Like that doesn't, you know, easy moments don't just happen. This piece wouldn't happen without the, you know, maybe agonizing over other pieces.
So true. And I know we're going over time, but one question here. Matthew, what drives you to make?
Oh, I've always, yeah, it's preternatural. It's just always something I've done. I mean, I've been drawing superheroes since I was 2 years old. I'm sure my mom could give a presentation of the drawings she's held on to. I used to draw superheroes without arms because I was like, oh, the arms, I don't like drawing those. So they were just walking around without arms. But I've always had a compulsion to create images. One of the things that I've felt really fortunate about is understanding something about myself and how I make is, I'm not great at working from a blank white page. And this is something I talk to my students about a lot, is that it just, at least for me personally, I do much better when I have something to react to, when I have something in front of me. So I think that's why for me, like, collage is so important. Appropriation is so important. My brain perks up when I respond to something else in the world. And it's rare that I'm purely happy just being, just being observer, and I like to react. So I maybe that's where a compulsion to make comes from.
And what you just said is such a good lesson, and I'm gonna leave it at that, because the lesson here is there's no wrong turn. Just keep making work and keep working and keep making your art, and I hope everyone does that.
Absolutely.
Again, I want to thank you for being here tonight. And this was fantastic, and your work is fantastic. And please let us know whatever you do. We'll be happy to attend, hopefully in person, any opening.
No.
So please do. And everyone, thank you for being here tonight. We'll have another one next week, so stay tuned, and have a great night. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, how'd that go?
It was perfect. It was just completely perfect.
That's
You
sweet.
should be extremely proud.
That's very kind.
Yeah, I loved it. Yes. I love to learn about your work more and more, and all the messages. There's so many.
Yeah, one might say too much.
And your brain.
By doing this, it's great.
The way your brain works, which is fantastic. So
From a distance, yes. I see Kevin out there. Kevin, how are you doing? It's been a while.
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing well. So yeah, I guess you're are you in a delayed mode until we